Welcome back, and today we're going to be installing rigid 2-inch rigid foam insulation on the west wall of the workshop. The west wall is behind me. It has a 8-foot wide by 10-foot tall roll-up door, but we're going to try to get that insulated today for you. So stay tuned and we'll get right on it. Okay, so I'm going to start out by just taking some dimensions, get some measurements. And what I'm basically doing is measuring between the vertical and horizontal metal and wood framing supports, and then the insulation will be cut to fit that particular panel. And then I'll just use a rubber mallet because the rigid insulation is so malleable. You're able to cut it to the exact size and then just take a rubber mallet and kind of bang it in place. I found that's the easiest way to install it. So here I am grabbing a piece, getting ready to cut it. And as far as cutting the insulation, there are a couple of methods to cut. Actually, there are a lot of ways that you could cut the rigid insulation. I think I tried cutting it on the table saw. And then I also tried just scoring it with a razor knife. But the best way that I found to cut the insulation is to basically just use a jigsaw with a blade that has reverse teeth on it. That to me was the easiest way to cut the insulation. The depth of the blade didn't quite go all the way through the 2-inch insulation, so once I made a pass and cut, I just would come back with a razor knife and just score the back of it like you would a piece of drywall, and that would finish the cut. And that seemed to work the best for me. So here's a look at the north wall, and you can see how the rigid insulated panels are installed. Also too, if you are going to use your table saw to cut the insulation, make sure that you reverse the blade. You want the blade on backwards. It will give you a cleaner cut, and it also won't grab on the insulation. So just make sure that you've got the blade reversed before you start cutting. You can see here that it still wants to bind up, which is why I stopped cutting it with the table saw. It was just much easier to cut it with the jigsaw. Okay, so here I have the panel installed. You'll notice that the full backing is facing out, and the reason for that is so the radiant heat, when it penetrates the metal building, it will hit the foil backing of the insulation and then reflect back to reduce and lower the amount of radiant heat that actually penetrates into the workshop. And also to help, I use foil HVAC tape to tape all the joints. I'm not sure that this was needed, but I just wanted to make sure that everything was sealed up and I had as tight of a fit as I could to keep any type of radiant heat out of the workshop, just to make it more energy efficient. Also, when installing the insulation, I want to keep it flush to the inside of the wall because then that will allow me the vapor barrier or the gap that I need. The wall thickness is about 2.5 inches. The rigid insulation is only 2 inches, so that leaves me a 1/2 inch gap. Plus, there's 3/4 inch ribs in the metal siding itself, so that should leave me a large enough vapor barrier or gap. Okay, so here's a view of the north wall, and you can kind of get an idea of how the installation process goes. I'm just basically cutting out squares to fit inside the wall cavities, and then I'm just going back with HVAC tape just to tape all the joints. And then there's the west wall over the overhead door, and that wall is complete. And then there's the south wall, and as you can see, I've already got the wood framing done, which is all part of my wall prep video, which I did previously. And that's the horizontal and the vertical wood framing that I'm going to need to fasten the T111 siding to. So I'll be tackling this wall next, and you can see the empty cavities that I just need to fill with the rigid insulation. And here I'm using the preferred method for cutting the insulation, which, like I said previously, is just a jigsaw with a reverse tooth blade on it. That seemed to work the best for me. As you can see, I'm cutting it directly on top of my workbench. The blade doesn't quite penetrate all the way through. And then when I'm done, I can just fold the piece over and take a razor knife and just score the full backing, and that completes the cut. And that was the easiest way I found to cut it. And so you can try different methods, but that's the best method I found. Okay, so I'm starting to install the 2-inch insulation underneath the 1-inch insulation in the ceiling, and just kind of wanted to give everyone a closer detail of what I've got going on in my metal building workshop. So what happens in a metal building, you've got metal roof trusses, then on top of the top cord of your roof truss, you have a purlin. The purlin runs parallel to your building, and the purlin mounts to the top cord of your roof truss, and then the metal decking screws to the purlin. So that leaves you a gap. And in that gap is where I installed the 1-inch insulation. Now, the thickness of the top cord is about 2.5 inches. So I went out and bought 2-inch insulation, and I'm going to fill that gap with 2-inch. So theoretically, I'm going to have a total of 3 inches of insulation in the ceiling and 2 inches of insulation in the walls. The only reason why I couldn't do this in the walls is because the walls don't have a purlin. It's just strictly a metal stud wall that's 2.5 inches thick. So all I could install is 2 inches of foam insulation. But in the ceiling, I was able to do a total of 3 inches. So let me kind of show you what's going on. So this is the new 2-inch panel that I installed, and you can see the top cord of the truss, and then the 1-inch insulation sits on the top cord where the purlin runs, and the purlin runs parallel throughout the whole building. So that's the gap where the 1-inch insulation sits, and then the gap between the 2.5-inch metal top cord of the truss is where the 2-inch panel will sit. So there's no air gap between the 2-inch and the 1-inch insulation. The only air gap is between the 1-inch insulation and the metal roof decking, which is, roughly, I think 1.5 inches. I'm hoping that's enough vapor barrier. It should be. I've got the same gap on the walls, so, hopefully that'll work. If not, so be it. That's all I can do. And like I said, the 2-inch insulation butts up flush to the 1-inch insulation, so there's no air gap, or it's minimal. And that's how I'm going to do it. And the wood decking that I'm going to be using, the plywood decking for the ceiling, will mount to the bottom of the roof truss, so the decking itself will hold the rigid insulation in place. So I don't have to use any liquid nail, anything. This is very malleable, and I'm able to just wedge it between the roof trusses, and then take and put up the plywood, and then the plywood will hold it. Now, in the area of my flat ceiling, I can do that in the vaulted portion, but in the attic portion, I might have to install some furring strips in this portion to hold the 2-inch insulation up. Like I said, it's very malleable. Okay, so now that I finally have the sheet in place, you can see I'm just hammering it down with the rubber mallet. I'm trying to lower it so it doesn't cover up the ridge vent. I have a ridge vent that runs all the way through the peak of the workshop, and the last thing I want to do is cover that ridge vent up. I want to be able to let the hot air that does get trapped into the attic space, give it a place to go to vent to the exterior. So that's why I was just scooting the sheet down. Now I'm just going to take the rubber mallet and just hammer it in place. Like I said, the rigid insulation is very malleable. It'll probably stay up by itself, but I will go back and put furring strips, at least in this section of the ceiling, just to make sure that it stays in place. Well, that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it helps you out in your project. And as always, get out there and create, build, and inspire, and pay it forward. Coming from the Ingrain Workshop, Ranger Rick out.